In the late 19th and early 20th century, large numbers of workers were not unionized, did not have representation, could not bargain with their employers. And so if they were in a workspace that was dangerous and they went to their boss and they said, you know, I'm worried about this staircase here because every time I go up and down the staircase, the stair waggles and I'm afraid I'm going to fall down and break my head. And the employer could just say, bye, you're fired. And if something happened, say that worker decided to keep the job, to go up and down the staircase, and one day the stair broke and the worker fell and broke an arm, couldn't work, what do they get? Nothing.
In the late 1800s, the United States experienced an industrial boom due to a population shift from rural to urban areas, technological advancements in industry, and increased migration of Europeans to American cities. This boom, called the Industrial Revolution, left the country in a state of improvement and economic growth. Newly opened factories needed workers, and lots of them. Millions of European workers were employed in those factories, eager to learn a living for their family and start a new life that was free from the poverty, intolerance, and war they had left behind in Europe. The reality of their new life in America was not as prosperous as they had hoped. Immigrants in cities such as New York and Chicago lived in crowded tenements, often clustered around the factories and slaughterhouses where they were employed. These tenements, which were originally designed for one family, often housed 10 to 12 people per apartment. These rooms had no running water or ventilation and were dimly lit. With no legal protection or safety regulations, workers also suffered harsh conditions in the workplace. Men, women, and children labored for long hours in dark, unventilated factories among dangerous machines. For this grueling work, they received just pennies a day. Whenever strikes were organized to protest the working conditions, they were often broken up by policemen hired by the factory owners. American author Upton Sinclair, who was working for a socialist newspaper called Appeal to Reason at the time, was commissioned to write a story about the lives of these immigrant workers. Since childhood, Sinclair was intrigued with the concept of rebellion and reform, and was eager to investigate the conditions inside the plants. He entered the facilities undercover, claiming he was a factory operative, and due to the lack of security policies, no one checked to verify his claim. The laissez-faire attitude of the government towards industry did not stop at security regulations, and Sinclair quickly realized the abundance of horrors waiting for him. After 7 weeks of research and observation, Sinclair's detailed account of the conditions inside Chicago's meat plants was published in Appeal to Reason in 1905. Due to immense popularity, it was published as a freestanding novel in February 1906, entitled The Jungle. There was never the least attention paid to what was cut up for sausage. They would come all the way back from Europe, old sausage that had been rejected and that was moldy and white. It would be dosed with borax and glycerin and dumped into the hoppers and made over again for home consumption. There would be meat that had tumbled out onto the floor, in the dirt and sawdust, where the workers had trampled and spit uncounted billions of consumption germs. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. A man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dry dung of rats. The packers would put poisoned bread out for them, and they would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. There was no place for the men to wash their hands before they ate their dinner, and so they made a practice of washing them in the water that was to be ladled into the sausage. There were some jobs that it only paid to do once in a long time, and among these was the cleaning out of the waste barrels. Every spring they did it, and in the barrels would be dirt and rust and old nails and stale water, and cartload after cartload of it would be taken up and dumped into the hoppers with fresh meat, and sent out to the public's breakfast. These are just some of the vivid accounts provided by Sinclair. Over time, the feedlots, slaughterhouses, and processing plants would come to be known as Packingtown. The public's reaction to the novel was a mix of anger and utter disgust. They were outraged that such filth was being fed to them by their own country. The government began to receive 100 letters a day demanding a federal cleanup of the meat industry. When word about the meat scandal spread overseas, countries around the world began to react. A series of cartoons named The Lodger and Chicago Tinned Meat emerged from a British printer and were then circulated in South Africa. The cartoons depict a traveler attempting to eat various products from Chicago's factories, and his appalled reaction when he witnesses creatures sprouting from the can amid rotten, putrid, and pickled substances. These cartoons gained popularity, worsening the United States' reputation. The meat trade overseas began to be threatened as other countries no longer wished to do business under such conditions. Sinclair began to send his own letters to President Roosevelt, explaining his purpose in investigating the industry and then asking for change. Sinclair provided suggestions to Roosevelt on the best way to conduct further inspections. Since the publication of The Jungle, factories were scrambling to clean up their facilities to avoid scandal and profit loss. Sinclair told Roosevelt that the legitimate, federally approved inspectors will have to be well disguised, and that 2 detectives would be in places where before there was only 1. When Roosevelt met with Sinclair to discuss the ordeal, he told him that while he disapproved of the way the book preached socialism, he agreed that radical action must be taken to do away with the unsanitary conditions and neglect of safety regulations in the factories. Roosevelt soon sent new, federally approved inspectors to every plant in Packingtown. When Sinclair's horrific claims were found to be true, Roosevelt made immediate changes to congressional laws. In June 1906, the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act were both passed. These laws prohibited the usage of unadulterated or misbranded meat, and ensured that they would be handled and processed in sanitary conditions. The U.S. Department of Agriculture was now required to inspect all livestock entering the plant before and after it was slaughtered. Even after these improvements were made in food safety, Sinclair was not entirely satisfied. His original intention for writing The Jungle was to bring attention to the injustice and mistreatment towards the workers in the industry. He found that much of the reforms were solely for regulations in food safety and sanitation, and not necessarily for the lives of the employees. Although this compromise was a huge advancement for the progressive movement, Sinclair was disappointed in the public's feeble response to the lack of protection given to workers in the dangerous factories. His efforts did not go ignored. However, it often took a great tragedy to evoke change. Later events such as the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire in 1911 were the catalyst for permanent safety regulations. In 1913, the Department of Labor was established, finally ensuring a safe working environment to all wage earners and providing benefits for healthcare and retirement. Workmen's compensation, established in 1915, was another powerful reaction to greater awareness of labor rights, and at last gave financial security to employees across the nation. The advancements in safety and the well-being of laborers in today's workplaces would not have been accomplished without the progressive reform movement and the influence of Upton Sinclair. Conflicts in industry led to various compromises for the public's overall safety and well-being. Now, with several government agencies regulating much more than just food sanitation, American workers can rely on their government for protection and security in the workplace and beyond.